we are facing and expecting, as he says in the speech, an invasion or the preparation for an invasion, probably a softening up from the air, to come at any point. So, as he says, the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is soon to begin.
Here's a mean question. Who's the better orator, Churchill or Hitler?
What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Upon it depends our own British life and the long continuity of our institutions and our empire. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned upon us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, then all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into bright, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Well, Roger Moorhouse, that was your finest 70 seconds.
Thank you very
That
much.
was something else. We had a big fight before we started recording about who would get to be Churchill, but I think, yeah, you nailed it. You won.
Thanks very much.
I think there's something quite illustrative about the fact that we had to fight about who would be Churchill, because he is one of the most recognisable speakers.
Yeah.
In all of recorded history. And we're here today to talk about one of his most famous speeches, which was recorded on this day, or delivered rather, on this day, 18th of June, 1940. He was an extraordinary orator. We're going to talk about how effective he was. And this is an extraordinary speech, isn't it?
Yeah, indeed. Absolutely. It has all the sort of the ingredients and the sort of the memorable moments, particularly that last paragraph, actually. But there's lots of other little rhetorical flourishes throughout it. And he was very good at this stuff. I mean, there's sort of, rule of threes and chiasmus and things like that. I'm sure you know all about you love a nice chiasmus as much as
I don't know what a chiasmus is. Are you being rude?
I was just using chiasmus as a sort of a double entendre, really, in that way. No, it's where you sort of juxtapose two things, like when he talked about El Alamein, and he talked about this isn't the beginning of the end, but it is the end of the beginning. That's chiasmus.
That's what ChatGPT does. That's AI writing now. That's it. That's like one of the towels. So ChatGPT is obviously gorged on Churchill.
On Churchill, exactly. So
wow.
it's a rhetorical, device. So anyway, yes, but he uses all of that, and there's a lot of that in this speech.
Roger, we should talk about the context in which this speech has been given. End of May. This is backs against the wall time for the British, right? Just the run up to this speech being given. Talk us through.
Yes, as that quote, that wonderful impression of Churchill told you, France has basically just fallen. The surviving British forces have been evacuated from Dunkirk, so that's the end of May. France falls. Germans have their parade through Paris. This is the moment for Britain. So Britain is now, those troops evacuated from Dunkirk were evacuated without most of their equipment, right? So we have a decent amount of men, but not much equipment, at least for the land army. And we are facing and expecting, as he says in the speech, an invasion or the preparation for an invasion, probably a softening up from the air, to come at any point. So, as he says, the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is soon to begin. We are facing and expecting, as he says in the speech, an invasion or the preparation for an invasion, probably a softening up from the air, to come at any point. So, as he says, the Battle of France is over. I expect the Battle of Britain is soon to begin, and so it proved. Right.
And there was
This is that moment.
yeah, and that, we think now of the decision to fight on as being rather a fait accompli, but actually just before this speech, it was not clear at all that that was what was
Yeah.
going to happen. Churchill's was a new government. The cabinet was split, right? Lord Halifax was leading a very strong party, demanding that we kind of open conversations with the Italians as a way of brokering peace with the Germans. Because basically, let's face it, no matter what he's about to say in this speech, it does look very much like we will lose at this point.
Mm,
Uh, Hitler has been unbelievably successful. The whole of Western Europe is ranged against us. The channel, although it is there, is very thin.
mm,
And everybody who knows anything at this stage is not optimistic.
yeah. And then along comes Churchill, and this is, I think that's really why this is, I suppose, such a seminal speech, is because it is a rallying cry, not only to the British people, but crucially to the Americans, to basically say, give us some support, back us, we're going to do the right thing. And it's like you said, this was absolutely contested as an idea because it wasn't really, to many people's minds, it wasn't a rational decision to make to actually try and fight on.
Although, I mean, we should be clear that the speech itself does not turn the issue of whether or not to fight again. That decision has been made.
Yeah,
Actually, thanks to Chamberlain, who supports Churchill in the kind of cabinet deliberations. And, so the speech is a rallying cry to an already made decision rather than
yeah,
part of the
yeah,
decision making. And like part of the real consideration for fighting on was that they were unlikely, looking at what was happening in France, they were unlikely to get terms from the Germans that were worse if they fought on than if they just surrendered now, right? They wouldn't expect anything good from the Germans right now.
yeah. I think
So,
the assumption was that, if you tried to make terms with the Germans, it would be at the cost of the empire, and it would be at the cost of the navy, for example. So, it
mm.
would be Britain reduced to, a shadow of its former self. And that was not something that certainly Churchill or many around him were willing to sign off on without a fight.
But the countervailing argument was we should at least have the conversation,
Mm,
right? But I think um, part of the reason to not have the conversation was to appeal to the Americans. And I know you think that this speech is very geared towards an American
yeah,
audience.
yeah,
But the American public at this time is massively against intervention in any way. They don't want to help the British. They're not imperialists. They don't like the British Empire. So, Churchill has to kind of create this narrative arc, doesn't he? Whereby it's the plucky underdog fighting on against the forces of evil, even
yeah.
though from the American perspective, the British Empire has long been considered to be the force of evil.
Yeah, it's true, and I think, Churchill knew that broadly Roosevelt was on side, but even Roosevelt was, basically trying to nudge the American people towards, a much more sympathetic attitude. This was the same sort of period where he's talking about, the US as an arsenal of democracy and all of that stuff. And crucially, Roosevelt is amping up his own rhetoric where, whenever there's, attacks by I talked about this in my U-boat book, um, where there's sort of attacks on American ships, American destroyers, and so on by U-boats. They're ramping up the rhetoric around that, saying that we're in a war whether we know it or not, whether we care for it or not.
Right.
So this is sort of grist to that mill. This is Churchill adding his two pennies worth to that mill to basically say, this is what we're doing is the moral thing. This is now a moral crusade, fighting against tyranny.
So he's going into making this crucial speech with the various audiences in mind. So there's the American public, there's members of the British establishment who think that we have lost already and that we should make terms. And there's, of course, the British people
Mm.
who were, only a year earlier, absolutely over the moon with appeasement and Chamberlain coming back and saying they didn't have to fight, right?
Mm.
So it's a very tight time frame. He's now having to persuade them that not only do they have to fight, but they have to fight against insuperable odds. So he's got quite a kind of task in when he sets out to make this speech, doesn't he? With these
Yeah,
different
yeah.
audiences.
I mean, crucially, I suppose you use the phrase insuperable odds. I mean, a lot of the speech is devoted to essentially saying, and this is where it's more targeted towards the British public, I suppose, but Americans as well. He's basically saying all is not lost. We've still got large numbers of men under arms. Says, that the Air Force is still in good shape. That RAF losses were much less significant than German losses had been in the French campaign. He's saying we've still got our navy; it's the largest navy in the world, and so on. So he's still saying that yes, we're up against it, but there's a lot here that we should feel positive about, and
So his
that's a
archiv
message to both the domestic audience and the Americans.
Yeah, so the archivists who kind of look after his papers say that he kind of wrote and rewrote and redrafted this speech, and you can see why, because it's very cleverly trying to do a number of things at the same time. It's telling a number of simultaneous stories, right?
Yeah.
We're the underdogs, but also it's not hopeless.
Yeah,
We're the moral crusaders, um, but also this isn't just a moral battle. This is a battle, for our very existence.
yeah,
He's got to do
and
a
it's a battle
number
that
of
he was
things.
saying is winnable. You know,
Yeah.
but if we all pull together, then it's a winnable one as well. So you're right.
Oh, and if we pull together with the empire, but
Yeah,
also not over egging the empire because of the Americans. So there's so many like competing things going on. Right. So set the scene about the speech itself, House of Commons, packed floor, all the
yeah,
diplomats
yeah,
in the stands. I was reading actually the diaries of Ivan Maysky, the Soviet
yeah.
ambassador who was there watching. So it was quite a dramatic moment in the house when he stands up,
Yeah,
right?
so the original speech is made to the House of Commons. It's not recorded, so the recorded version is the later one that he did, repeated it for radio. So in the original speech, by all accounts, it was delivered with a lot of sort of trademark Churchill theatricality. He did sort of ramp up the rhetoric, which is what you'd expect. And again, the reception is actually remarkably positive. I mean, interestingly, I read that particularly among the Labour benches, they were very keen to cheer him, and at the end of the speech, the cheers were louder from the Labour benches than they were from the Tory benches, and that's partly because they probably want to sort of, in a sense, stick the boot into to Chamberlain. Um, but still, that it was very well received. It lasts pretty, the best part of half an hour, so it's quite long, and it most of it is um, a sort of summing up of the situation. It's
Mm,
this is what's happened in France. This doesn't affect how we feel. We're still going to fight on. He says, if necessary, alone. It's one of those crucial lines. And then he goes through this roundup of all the positives, as I said. So he talks about this, the strength, the numbers of men we have under arms. The strength of the Air Force. That strength is undiminished. He says we've enormously improved our methods of defence. He says individual aircraft and individual British pilots have a sure and have a sure and definite superiority, he says, over the enemy.
mm,
So there is no reason whatsoever for panic or despair. So this is that sort of balancing act that he's portraying, right?
yeah.
Yes, it's bad. Yes, we need help. Yes, we need everyone to pull together. But actually, we're not in bad shape. And he also makes that really interesting offer to the French, which had been made before, of a union with France, a common citizenship between Britain and France, which had
Mm,
been made before. But he reiterates it in this speech, as if that's
mm,
the last throw of the dice for a dying France. But obviously, it wasn't one that was capable of being taken up.
mm,
Um, so the other aspect that's worth mentioning is where he talks a lot. There's a lot of, rhetorically, there's a lot of we, there's a lot of us. It's very personal
mm,
in that respect, right? That comes across
yeah.
very strongly. And he also talks a
Mm,
lot about about civilization, right? Western civilization, our laws and institutions, all of that stuff comes across in many different references, and where nowadays the whole concept of Western civilization has kind of been babied out with the bathwater. Then it kind of meant something. People heard the words Western civilization and they thought it was a positive, right? They thought, yes, this is what we're fighting for: rule of law, all of democracy, all of that stuff.
Can I
So
ask
he's
another
playing
question
on
about
that.
that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're this is kind of your bag, but like our retrospective view of the Nazis, everything terrible about them is related to the Holocaust, right?
Mm.
So we view everything through the prism of the Holocaust, rightly, because the Holocaust is the biggest crime against humanity, blah, blah, blah. Um, in terms of then his idea of the Nazis being a civilizational threat in 1940, before they know the extent of the crimes against the Jews,
Mm.
what is he actually, what is it about Nazism from the British perspective that is so frightening? Is it just that this is a German threat to a British empire?
Mm.
Or is this genuinely a ideological threat from a regime that they find, terrifying? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that there's a phrase which gives you a little chink of light in that, which is in that passage that I read at the beginning. He talks about the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. And I think he's
Oh,
talking
I
about the
see.
science of race, right?
Yeah, of
So
course.
the perverted science. So that's where, he's pinpointing that. It's like it's almost as if they know, in a sense, they know what's coming. This is
I
the
mean, they've seen the
twisted race
person.
things.
And they've seen the persecution of the Jews, right? They
Yeah.
just haven't seen the conclusion of the persecution of the Jews.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. So I think that's the essence of what he's and again the tyranny, they would have had ample examples of the upending of the rule of law in Nazi Germany up until that point. You think of the Night of the Long Knives, for
Mm.
example, that was already in 1934. So
And
there's enough evidence.
of course, Churchill's great friends with the Poles at this point, anyway.
Yeah.
And he can see what's happened to Poland as a result of
Yeah.
the deportations of the Nazis, because the Poles were particularly horrific in Poland.
Yeah. No, exactly. So the treatment of the Poles in that, just in the German campaign against the Poles, as I've written before, there are over 600 massacres committed against POWs and civilians in the 5 weeks of the Polish campaign.
And they know this, right? The
And they
British
know
know
this,
this.
right? But they know, well, they probably know enough about it to know that that was an absolutely brutal, no holds barred campaign from the German perspective. So, enough of that
Which,
intelligence would have come out via the Polish government in exile.
and you have this contention that we can talk about in a minute of Churchill as a romantic.
Hmm.
And in his sort of romantic idea of warfare, which I guess you get flickers of, in his own exploits in the Boer War
Hmm.
and whatever, the way the Germans behave, the Nazis behave, particularly in Poland,
Hmm.
is extraordinarily savage and does not
Hmm.
abide by the kind of ideas of gentlemanly warfare that Churchill
Yeah.
kind of at least pays lip service to, doesn't he? Even if he doesn't always.
Yeah, no, exactly. And you're right. You mentioned the Boer War and stuff. He was there. Imprisoned and escaped from his imprisonment and things like that. His own life is, certainly militarily, has a sort of a boy's own quality to it. And
Mm,
that's to some extent how he viewed the war. He viewed it in that sense of, as a big adventure, as of course there's going to be lives lost and all the rest of it. And it's a serious business. I'm not playing that down. But there was an element, look at his establishment of SOE, you know, uh, he sort of sees it almost as a sort of a game, that it's something, to sort of push the boundaries and see what, see how many, in how many ways you can prod the enemy. Um, it's that, and again, even geopolitically, he sees it the same way. He always talks about things like the Ljubljana Gap, and it's the same logic is played out with the Dardanelles campaign in the First World War. He's always looking for the back door where you can kind of, go and catch the enemy by surprise and things like that. So he kind of loves warfare. right?
Yeah.
He's kind of obsessed with it in a way, and certainly in a way that Chamberlain is the opposite end of the spectrum. You know, he hates it. He sees it as the greatest evil visited on mankind, which is what takes him down the blind alley of appeasement, for example. So
I mean,
that's where I think that's where I come to that aspect of sort of a romantic element as well.
I think sort of this is where we part company, right? So we've talked a little bit about the speech. We kind of talk now about like reactions to it and the aftermath. And I think this is where we part company. I think I'm far more team Chamberlain than you are, right?
Right.
Because, so many of the adventurous things that Churchill's always flying fail dismally.
Yeah.
SOE is a complete flop. He's always after a kind of daring commando raid. And I understand that all of these things have moral and political purpose beyond kind of, the whether they actually work or not, right?
Yeah.
But as you say, so much of it's playing and it's playing with lives. And I think that, I'm a mother of three teenagers. If I was watching Churchill's speech or listening to Churchill's speech in 1940, I would have wanted him to go and boil his head and jump down a well. I would have been, when Chamberlain got back off the plane with that piece of paper, I'd have been at the airport wanting to kiss his feet. Like Britain had had one horrific war with Germany. And he's asking people
To go and do it again.
to go and do it again. And I
Yeah.
and I and I get and I get why he has to, and I understand the barbarism of the Nazis, etc. However, I almost find his rhetorical bombast like annoying. Because you know this is a huge ask of the mothers of Britain, right?
Yeah.
The boys are going to go off and fight, and whatever. But this is a huge ask, and to sort of, I find wrapping it up in this layer of romanticism.
Mm.
I can see why it's effective, and I can see what he's doing. I just, I end for me. I actually, now that I'm old and middle aged, and I have children, I find it distasteful. When I was 20, I would have been signing up to be in whatever, the Wrens or whatever, and just loving it all. But like now I'm sort of old and grumpy. I'm like,
Right. I
save
mean,
your rhetorical flourishes for your fucking mirror.
two things on that, Senior. The first one is I never knew you were French, but uh,
Cheese eating surrender monkey.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, there's that revelation. But the other more serious thing to mention is that actually, you know, if you look into the public reaction to this and the reaction of some politicians and some commentators, it isn't universally popular, right?
Mm.
Um, and this is an interesting aspect because we do sugarcoat Churchill in this country to a large extent, and we look back, with rose tinted glasses on all of these speeches, and imagine how motivating and inspiring they must have been. And I think for a lot of people, the reaction was what you've just described.
Yeah.
What's interesting in this respect is also the method of delivery, because, as I said, when it was originally made, it was made in the House of Commons, wasn't recorded, with all the sort of rhetorical flourishes and all of the theatricality. And when it was broadcast to the people, because they are the crucial audience, really, to convince them,
Mm.
when it's
Sure.
broadcast to the people by radio, he was obliged to go and read it for recording for the broadcast. So and he didn't like doing that. So the if you listen to the speech as it's recorded, which is on YouTube, it's about 25 minutes long, whatever. A lot of it sounds very kind of flat, and even that most rousing last paragraph that I read is kind of delivered quite flatly. And the way people tended to respond. I mean, some people did say, good old Winston and all that sort of thing. But there are some people that are reportedly saying, well, we need leadership. Where's the leadership in that?
Mm.
So a lot of people out in the country were profoundly unimpressed, which is kind of interesting, bearing in mind how we tend to sugarcoat these things.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose in one sense, there is no easy way to say, you know, we
Your
kind of,
children might die.
yeah, and we've got no
Yeah,
choice.
yeah.
Um, and I suppose there is validity in the argument that at this stage they had no choice. Although the other thing that struck me about the speech as I was reading it is that when you read it with the, you know, with the neat benefit of hindsight, it makes the war feel like a very Pyrrhic victory because, some of the things that he really brings out is like, oh, we're going to restore freedom to the Poles and the Czechs. Well,
Mm,
okay, no, you didn't. Um, the other thing he talks about is, he's very clear at the end where he talks about the finest hour. That is not the finest hour of Britain. That is the finest hour of the empire. And
yes.
as we were saying when we were going into this, he knows going into it that part of what Britain will have to sacrifice if it doesn't fight is the British Empire. But Britain ends up losing the empire because of the war anyway. I mean,
Yeah.
you can argue as much as you like about, the kind of process behind decolonization, but the bottom line was we couldn't afford the empire anymore,
Yes.
which is why we were so quick to give up, the vast majority of it after the war. So, when you look at the speech itself versus the sort of, end game, it does look rather Pyrrhic, I thought.
Yeah, I agree, and that's been said. That particular line about the finest hour. If the British Empire and its Commonwealth should last for 1,000 years, men will still say that this was their finest hour. Um, that sounds like a prediction of decline, doesn't it? Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was the high point. Okay, was the fact that we fought on. That's quite an interesting take. I know, and I completely agree with what you say that the reality of the choice for fighting on was that it cost us the empire. The country was bankrupt by the end of the war. In hock to its
Yeah.
creditors, and couldn't sustain the empire. So absolutely
So
right.
arguably, if they had chosen to make peace with Hitler in 1940, we might well have ended up with the same outcome. The Poles and the Czechs enslaved just to Hitler and sort of to Stalin,
Mm.
which, I'm not saying that's this is not the show for comparing those two fates, right? We're not going to get into that right now. And the empire gone, and I guess France stays German, but I mean, like you can. I'm not saying we shouldn't have fought. I think on
No,
balance we should, but I'm just
but
saying that
yeah.
it's not as clear cut as the speech and our mythology around the speech and our sort of myth making around the war. It's not all as clear cut as it's
No, it's
subsequently
not. No,
presented.
absolutely not. But you did crucially you used the phrase just now with the benefit of hindsight. And
Yeah, 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 yeah. All right, all
Churchill
right.
on June 18th, 1940, didn't have the benefit of hindsight.
Yeah,
And in that respect, you could say, he was taking a punt. Maybe with the lives of 300 odd thousand young men and women of British and Allied armed forces, but he was taking a punt on you know trying to preserve civilization as he saw it. So, you know, cut the guy some slack, senior. Come on.
yeah. All right, all right. And I am also. I want to put on record. I am not anti-Churchill in the sense that I am not in the market for making up nonsense about him, for example, about the Bengal famine in
Yeah.
order to attack him. And I don't think the war was
No,
his
that's fine.
fault, as the current vogue
Yeah.
is among
Wow.
certain right-wing people. I just think we always need to just tease out the fact that he's not a kind of
Yeah.
perfect figure.
No, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. Now books.
Yes.
We are here in the business of books.
Yes.
Brilliant book that I was reading on this, which is called The Roar of the Lion by Richard Toye, Toye. Came out about, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe. Um, and he essentially tells the history of World War II through the prism of Churchill's speeches, and he
Mm.
dissects them really well. He talks about the reaction. He talks about how they were sort of scripted, how much effort Churchill puts into them, and where that sort of fits into the political and military context at each point. And it's
Yeah.
really, really, really well done. So I absolutely recommend that. The Roar of the Lion, fantastic. Um, and I would also, again, it is quite, you know, well, it's magisterial, but it's also very pro Churchill. But I think with justification is, of course, Andrew Roberts' biography,
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, it is
which is
brilliant.
absolutely fantastic.
I mean, I'm not a Churchill stan, obviously, but I do adore that book. I think it's so good and so comprehensive. I also want to throw into the mix, I found this very helpful in thinking about the decision to carry on fighting, was Ian Kershaw's Fateful Choices, 10 Decisions That Changed the World, because he takes that decision to carry on fighting
That moment.
and really unpicks it. And I found that very helpful. So those books, I think we can fully recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I really enjoyed actually reading that chapter in The Roar of the Lion. I thought really enjoyed it again. I read it I think I reviewed it a long time ago. Really enjoyed reading that chapter again. And, you know, it's a very good book.
Okay, here's a mean question. Who's the better orator, Churchill or Hitler?
Interesting. For those of us like me who have listened to more than their fair share, you could say, of Hitler speeches.
Not in a bad way.
Not in a bad way, and crucially understand what he's saying. Hitler is I think, a really weirdly bad orator. It's all emotion. It's all pushing buttons. I struggle to see how Hitler was a good orator. The wording is very often, you know, doesn't have the finesse, it doesn't have the nuance that Churchill deploys. And even when you understand the words, it it's as if the reaction to it is purely like a sort of chemical reaction. It's an emotive reaction, and it's
So
very
it's like
hard
the
to
vibe of a crowd kind of
It's
thing.
exactly that. It feels like that. So I really struggle to see how Hitler is a very good orator. And by contrast, you listen to listen to Churchill, and as I said before, you know, Churchill, it's almost as though when you listen to the recorded versions of his speeches, the most emotive bits where Hitler would be going, right? You get my drift. That was quite a good impression, I thought. But where Hitler's doing all of that stuff and gesticulating and, you know, spittled microphone and all of that, Churchill, and I don't know if this was deliberate or not, but he sort of goes down a notch. It's like the most emotive parts of the speeches are delivered in a more deadpan manner, which I think is really interesting. And I wonder, very speculative this, but I wonder if that was a deliberate response to the sort of, you know, the hysterical,
Histrionics,
the histrionics as well of the Hitler delivery, whether he just thought, I'll take it down a notch and it'll be very emotive, but the delivery will be deadpan. I would just wonder if that was the case. So to answer your question, I would say Churchill all day long.
So I love the fact that we have bookended this podcast with Roger Moorhouse doing impressions of Churchill and doing impressions of Hitler. Listen.
Well, I'm a man of many talents. What
can you say? Listen, before we get cancelled, I think let's sign off, because if we do any more Hitler impersonation, we will be in trouble. So that was wonderful. Tour de force. Thank you so much, Roger. And we'll see you next time.
Next time.